Hey, welcome to Kids Week at the Intrepid Museum. My name is Mike Massimino. I'm a former NASA astronaut and I am now on staff here at the Intrepid, but it's my pleasure today to introduce my friend Allison Bolinger. Allison's one of my favorite people for a number of reasons. She's just fun to hang around with, but she's also great to work with. Very well respected, great experience at NASA, and a great communicator. Allison comes and speaks in my class. She didn't do it this year. I felt bad about asking you, but I think I'm going to ask you next year. But I teach up at Columbia, and she is the favorite guest lecturer that we have come into the class every year, and influences and inspires my students more than I do throughout the year, actually. They really do enjoy having her come. Those are college students, and she's able to communicate with astronauts, other engineers, students of all ages, and it's just terrific. So we're very happy to have her here. She's going to tell you about her background, some highlights, but she went to Purdue Aerospace Engineer. She worked as a co-op at NASA. She always worked in EVA for NASA, and she was an instructor, including teaching me, I think, toward the end of my career there, in the pool, how to do spacewalks, and she advanced very quickly through all of that to become the lead of that group, which is a pretty big deal, especially for astronauts, because they taught us how to spacewalk, the EVA, the spacewalking group. They were the instructors, but they also, the only group like this, still probably, right, that also worked in the control room. So they were both instructors and flight controllers. Everything else, you'll have an instructor teach you how to do other things, the other systems, and then it was someone else in the control room. But the EVA people were so close with us that we had them both as instructors, and then they were in a control room to support the mission. She did that as the leader of that group, and then also ran our training facility called the NBL, the Neutral Buoyancy Lab, which was a giant pool.
You're going to see a video of that.
She's going to show you some of that. So she ran that, and now she's a flight director. Being a flight director is a really cool job. Being an astronaut is also a cool job. But being a flight director is even more selective than being an astronaut. There's been hundreds of astronauts over the years. We have Ricky Arnold here. You get a chance to hear him later. He's speaking, I think, at noon, and then you're going to do it together at 3. But there's hundreds of astronauts over the years, but still less than 100 flight directors.
97 flight directors.
So, and it's a great tradition going back to the early days. People might have heard of Gene Kranz from Apollo 13. And they are that is not an easy job to get to do. A lot of people want to do that job. It's very selective, and you're in charge. You have to know you have to be able to handle a lot of people, handle a crew in orbit, and be a leader of that team. The flight director makes the big decisions, and it's a lot of responsibility. So those are great credentials, and Allison's also just a wonderful communicator, a great speaker. Let's give her a hand, and you're in for a treat.
All right, thanks, guys. Thank you, Mike. I appreciate the introduction. All right. Okay, how are you guys doing today? All right. So like Mike said, my name is Allison Bolinger, and I work at NASA's Johnson Space Center. And there I spent about 12 years teaching astronauts to spacewalk. So I taught them all about the spacesuit that they wear, the tools that they use outside, and then we do a lot of our training in the Neutral Buoyancy Lab, which is one of the world's largest pools. So you'll see a video about this shortly. So most of my presentation will be focused on how we get astronauts ready to spacewalk. But like Mike said, I am currently a flight director, so I do have a few slides that talk about that. So without any further ado, I'll go ahead and start this video. I'm Allison Bolinger, and I work as a spacewalk flight controller and trainer here at Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. So my job is we actually get the astronauts ready to go to the International Space Station and perform all aspects of spacewalking.
Read the wire tie on the sail aft side.
And now we're focused on the International Space Station, maintaining it while it's serving out its mission. But meanwhile, folks within my organization and astronauts as well who have this spacewalking experience are thinking about how can we improve this spacesuit? How can we modify this spacesuit to make it more suited for a mission on an asteroid, or more suited for a mission to Mars or to the moon? So we're constantly thinking about how can we modify our existing spacesuit. Then a majority of the training takes place in the Neutral Buoyancy Lab. One of the largest indoor pools in the world. It's a roughly 200 feet by 100 feet that's 40 feet deep, and we use this to simulate space. and it's how we train astronauts to perform spacewalks on the International Space Station. Because the space station is so large, we can't fit the entire space station in the pool. We have to break the different components apart to simulate the entire space station. This suit weighs about 175 pounds. So once the crew member gets inside the suit, they actually have a large crane that just will lift this whole stand up, and they'll take it over the water and just lower it down into the water. We train them about the tools that they're going to use when they're out performing the spacewalk. They do a whole choreographed spacewalk where they learn about the different components of the space station and how they can fix them. The next part of my job is to actually be in mission control and to help choreograph the spacewalk, especially when things go wrong. We're considered the experts and we can help tell the astronauts how to fix the situation. Okay, the next thing we're going to have you guys do is get inside the airlock and then work on hooking up your safety tether and heat. The wall is lined with, we call them the big boards, and you've got big video monitors where you're watching either what the crew is doing or what the crew is seeing, and you've got all the data displayed in front of you, and then you've got computer monitors in front of you where you've got pulled up all the different, we call them the parameters of the spacesuit. So the spacesuit is constantly downlinking data to the Earth. The first time I sat in the front room by myself was the STS-134 mission, which was the final flight of Space Shuttle Endeavour in May of 2011. You sit down and initially it's completely overwhelming because you're realizing like, wow, I'm finally here after all these years. I'm finally here, doing my dream job. So it was pretty cool. I was able to go to space camp in 6th grade at the Kennedy Space Center. You were able to meet a bunch of kids from around the country that were all very passionate about space. We did some different training exercises, and it's what I'm actually doing now. It's how I'm actually training astronauts now, so it's neat to think back that I was able to experience it, as a child. And for me personally, I found out that training the astronauts is the best of both worlds, because you still get a lot of the same experiences that the astronauts get, but you don't actually have to strap yourself into a rocket and launch into space to do it. The really neat thing is occasionally when they're out actually doing a spacewalk, they'll mention your name, or they'll say, I want to say hi to Houston, and specifically, our EVA team, and it's always really fun to get a shout out from space. I definitely feel like I'm with them every step of the way outside, and one of my personal favorite sayings, and it's actually on the back of this chart, is it says, shoot for the moon, even if you miss, you'll be among the stars. I had confidence in myself that I could eventually achieve my goals, but I'm still just blown away when I'm sitting in mission control and watching crew members that I trained actually perform spacewalks. I'm doing the job that I absolutely love. All right, so that was just a little bit to kind of get a feel for how we train astronauts to get ready to spacewalk. So a little bit more about me. I grew up in Central Ohio loving math and science and space. How many kids out here love math and science and space? Look at all those hands. How many of you want to be an astronaut when you grow up? All right. So I also wanted to be an astronaut when I was younger, but then as I got a little bit older, I realized I get car sick, I'm afraid of heights, I don't like roller coasters. Maybe I don't, as I mentioned in the video, I don't want to strap myself into a rocket, but I knew I still wanted to work for NASA. So with that in mind, I went to Purdue University in West Lafayette, Indiana, and there I majored in aerospace engineering. And like Mike mentioned, as I was a student at Purdue, I was lucky enough to be part of the cooperative education program or internship program. So that's where I would spend a semester at Purdue, and I would spend a semester down at Johnson Space Center working. So it extended my graduation by a year, but it was well worth it. So for any students out there who are approaching high school and college age, I highly encourage you to think about interning while you're working on your degree, because it's a great way to test the waters to make sure you're truly in the field that you're meant to be in. So highly recommend interning. So after I graduated in 2004, moved down to Houston, so I've been at NASA for about 15 and a half years now. So a majority of that time was spent doing the spacewalk training. But like we said, I'm now a flight director. So a little bit more about the role of the flight director. So there are 97 of us, about 26 of us that are active flight directors right now. And so our job is to work in mission control. First and foremost, always, keep the astronauts safe. Second objective, keep the space station safe, because this is a multi-billion-dollar lab that we've got up in space. And third is complete those mission objectives. So I have a room full of flight controllers who are different subsystem experts, whether it's thermal or power or crew health. They're constantly feeding me data, and then I'm making the ultimate decisions about which direction we need to go, especially when things start going wrong. So you heard the mention of Gene Kranz. Does anyone recognize Gene Kranz? Ed Harris played him in the Apollo 13 movie. So what's neat about these pictures is up here when I was an intern back in 2001, I got to meet Gene. He gave a lecture to the interns. And then I got to see him again this past July as we were celebrating 50 years since Apollo 11. He was also one of the flight directors when we landed on the moon. So it was pretty neat to come full circle and to be able to tell Gene, I saw you back then and now here I am 20 years later and now I am a flight director myself. So that's pretty fun. Another tradition we have is the flight directors name themselves. We get to create our call signs. So it started out with Dr. Christopher Kraft. He was Red Flight. Gene was known as White Flight. You would see him wear those white vests. So by the time we got to number 95, we were pretty much all out of colors, all out of elements, all out of gemstones. And so I went with Athena Flight as the goddess of wisdom and courage. I figured that was very fitting for what NASA's getting ready to do. So known as Athena Flight. All right, and the other exciting thing, I just recently led my first mission. So this was an unmanned resupply cargo craft, so made by the Northrop Grumman Company. It was the 13th launch, so Northrop Grumman, we call it NG-13. Cygnus is the name of the vehicle. So it launched just a week ago. It spent about 2 days making its way up to the International Space Station. So this was just on Tuesday. So I finished my job on Tuesday, hopped on a plane, and came here to talk to you guys. So I'm responsible for making the decisions once the Cygnus vehicle gets up close to the space station, and we're controlling all of that from the ground until it gets just a couple meters from the space station, and then the astronauts in space use the robotic arm to slowly grab onto that vehicle, and then the ground takes over again and we maneuver it to one of the docking ports. So this was pretty exciting that I was able to lead my first mission just a couple days ago. And our spacecraft was actually named after Air Force Major Robert Henry Lawrence Jr. Robert was selected as the first African-American astronaut back in 1967. However, unfortunately, he died in a plane crash just a few months later, so he never got a chance to fly in space, but we honor his legacy by naming our spacecraft after him. So that's a little bit about what I do now. Let's go back in time and we can talk a little bit more about spacewalking. All right, so we do a majority of our spacewalking, actually all of our spacewalking right now is focused on the International Space Station. You guys heard of the International Space Station? Has anyone seen it fly overhead at night? That's definitely something I recommend. Go to nasa.gov and they have a Spot the Station link and you can see the space station fly overhead. It's one of the brightest objects in the sky. It takes about 6 minutes to go from one side of the sky to the other. So the space station is the only scientific laboratory that's currently 250 miles above our head. So it takes about an hour and a half for the space station to go around the Earth. So they're seen every 45 minutes, they're seeing a sunrise or a sunset on the space station. They're traveling at 17,500 miles per hour, so it's moving pretty quickly. It truly is an international collaboration. We've got 5 space agencies represented: NASA, the Canadian Space Agency, the Russian Space Agency, Japanese Space Agency, and the European Space Agency. So for a total of 15 countries have worked on our International Space Station. We launched the first piece way back in 1998, and coming up this fall, our first crew launched in 2000. So this fall, we will be celebrating 20 years of continuous human presence in space. So think about that. For the past 20 years, longer than any of you kids have been alive, we have always had humans living and working in space. So that's a pretty exciting milestone. We currently have 3 people living there, 2 Americans, Jessica and Drew, and 1 Russian cosmonaut. So the area where the astronauts live, or the habitable volume of these pressurized modules, it's about the size of a 5-bedroom house. So when the astronauts go up to the space station, they'll stay usually around 6 months. But if you recently heard Christina Cook, a NASA astronaut, just returned home after having spent 328 days in space. So she's now the female record holder for long duration flight. But normally they're up there for 6 months. So think about being up there, and normally we have 6 or 7 people on the space station. So think about being in a 5-bedroom house for 6 months with 5 or 6 of your closest friends. It's probably not too bad, but you are floating in space with some pretty incredible views. So I'm sure they enjoy being up there. And including the solar arrays, which is how the space station generates power, it's the size of a football field, including the end zone. So you'll see a picture later on, an astronaut in a big, huge 750-pound spacesuit. On the truss, which is the backbone of the space station, the astronaut looks about this big on the truss. So to help put things in perspective, our space station is very large. All right, so how we built the space station, as I mentioned, we launched the first element of the space station back in 1998, and that was on a Russian rocket. And then after that, we spent about 37 space shuttle missions, and that number needs to be updated. That's actually more like 230 spacewalks to assemble the space station. So during those 37 space shuttle missions, each time you see a new element kind of being added that represents a space shuttle flight. So we would bring up that new component of the space station inside the payload bay of the space shuttle. So the space shuttle would launch, dock to the space station, and then we would use the robotic arm to grab that new piece of the space station, maneuver it over, and then we would do a series of spacewalks to either use our pistol grip tool or our battery-powered drill to bolt together the pieces of the space station or make electrical connections or fluid connections and slowly work to build this space station. So as I mentioned, we started back in 1998. We called ourselves Assembly Complete in 2011. So with the final space shuttle flight in 2011, we had all the major elements up there on the space station. However, we're continuing to upgrade and to repair things on the space station. One of the more notable things that we've added to the space station recently are new docking ports for the commercial crew vehicles. So if you guys have heard about the Boeing CST-100 vehicle and the SpaceX Crew Dragon vehicle, those are two vehicles that later this year will be launching NASA astronauts from Florida. So this will be the first time since 2011 that we're launching NASA astronauts from US soil. So it's a very exciting time for us. Because since we retired the space shuttle in 2011, we've been relying on the Russians to get our NASA astronauts up to space, launching on the Soyuz rocket. So we had to retrofit some of the docking ports to be able to accommodate those new vehicles. But as you can see, there's our beautiful space station. Assembly complete. All right, talk a little bit more about EVAs, or extravehicular activities. You'll notice that NASA really likes to use acronyms. You guys know what an acronym is? That's when they take the first letter of multiple words and to create a shorter word. NASA itself is an acronym, standing for the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. But I can, I'll rattle off, we've got the PGT, the LCVG, the BRT, the AET, the RET, so a lot of acronyms that I'll point out later. So EVA just stands for spacewalking, basically. So some of the major components that we'll talk about spacesuit a little bit, we'll talk about the tools that they use, and then we'll talk about the training facilities, where we get the astronauts ready. So I mentioned seeing the little tiny astronauts on the backbone of the space station. It's rotated here, but you can see the little tiny astronauts right here in their big spacesuits. So to give you a feel for how big the space station actually is. All right, so let's learn a little bit more about the EMU, or the Extravehicular Mobility Unit, or the spacesuit. Here I am modeling my very own spacesuit. When I sent this picture to my grandmother a few years ago, she asked, "Did you get to keep the spacesuit?" I said, no, Grandma, they're pretty expensive, and no, NASA let me borrow it and try it on, but I did not get to keep the spacesuit. So the neat thing about the EMU is you can think of it as basically a mini spacecraft, and that's what's keeping the astronaut alive outside of the comforts of their space station. So it needs to provide all the life support functions to keep the astronaut alive, and that all happens in the PLIS, or the Primary Life Support System. So the backpack on the spacesuit contains tanks of oxygen. The astronauts are breathing pure oxygen inside their spacesuit. They're not breathing air like we are now. It contains oxygen, it contains battery power, it contains water to keep the astronauts cool, which we'll talk about. It also contains a canister that helps remove the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere inside the spacesuit. So when you exhale, you're exhaling carbon dioxide, and when you're in a confined space like the spacesuit, that could become toxic and almost deadly if we didn't do something to remove it. So we have a canister that absorbs that CO2, carbon dioxide, to help keep the astronauts safe while they're outside. So the shirt, or the top of the spacesuit, is called the HUT, the hard upper torso. It's made out of fiberglass. It comes in 3 different sizes, medium, large, and extra large. I feel pretty comfy in a medium. We also have TMG, or thermal micrometeorite garment, which is what's covering the outside of the spacesuit. So the TMG is a pretty neat material. It's actually multiple layers that make up, so the outermost layer is white to reflect the light of the sun. So when we talk about when the sun's shining on you, it's positive 250 Fahrenheit. When you're in the shade, it's minus 250 Fahrenheit. So we have quite the extremes up there on the space station. So it's white to reflect the light. It's also made of a ripstop material, because as I mentioned, you're traveling at 17,500 miles per hour, and there's lots of space junk, unfortunately, around the space station. Whether it's meteorites, little pieces of broken up spacecraft. So if anything were to hit the spacesuit, that could be deadly. So this material helps protect the astronauts. We also have a couple layers of aluminized mylar to keep the astronauts warm when they're in those cold areas. And the most important part is the bladder. So this yellow material is what's actually keeping the oxygen inside the spacesuit. So this is a very important part to help keep that spacesuit airtight. So that's the TMG. See, what else do we have? The DCM, another acronym. The display and control module is on the front of the spacesuit, and that's the computer that's allowing the astronaut to interface with the suit, turn things on and off. It also has a display on the top that'll notify the astronaut if something's going wrong with their spacesuit. So we're monitoring all that down in Houston at Mission Control, but this allows the astronauts to have insight into their own spacesuit. Another cool piece of hardware I'll talk about is the LCVG, or Liquid Cooling and Ventilation Garment. So we mentioned the spacesuit itself is designed to be airtight, right? Because you don't want that precious oxygen to escape. But think about it, that also means your body heat can't escape. So as you're in this confined space, it's getting warmer and warmer and warmer. The astronauts would actually overheat and pass out after about just 30 minutes if they weren't wearing this LCVG. So this is the liquid cooling and ventilation garment. You can see it's got hundreds of tubing, hundreds of feet of a very small tubing, and this circulates cold water over the astronaut's body. So there's a knob on the front of the spacesuit that you can adjust that'll change how cold the water is. But this is what's keeping the astronauts nice and comfy while they're inside their spacesuit. So that's a very important piece of the spacesuit. All right, we've got a DIDB, disposable in-suit drink bag. So your typical spacewalk lasts 6.5 hours, and it takes them about 4 hours to get ready before they can even start their spacewalk. So you are in your spacesuit for 10 to 11 hours. They don't have any food. They do have 32 ounces of water, so they can stay nice and hydrated while they're out there working hard. But what's going to happen after you drink all this water and you're stuck in your spacesuit for a few more hours? Enter the MAG, the Maximum Absorbency Garment. This is a very high-tech NASA diaper. So every astronaut is wearing a diaper inside his or her spacesuit because I mentioned it takes 4 hours to get ready to go outside to do your spacesuit. So if you have to go to the bathroom, you can't just stop your spacewalk and come inside. So everyone's wearing a MAG inside their spacesuit. All right, we also have a safer, simplified aid for EVA rescue. This is a compressed nitrogen jetpack that the astronauts wear on their back. So we'll talk about the safety tether that ensures the astronauts always attached to the space station. But if something were to go wrong with that, they can flip a handle, deploy a hand controller, and then fly themselves back to the space station. So they're always wearing this, but thank goodness we have never had to use it. So you've also got helmet lights, which you'll see in a next picture. Helmet lights for when it's dark during those 45 minutes of night, and you have a fancy gold visor that acts as sunglasses during the 45 minutes of light. And let's see, we also have radios to be able to talk, so the astronauts can talk to me in Mission Control. They wear, the radios, they wear a cap, and we call it a Snoopy cap. Are you guys familiar with Snoopy the dog? We call it a Snoopy cap because it looks like Snoopy the dog. So these have two speakers they can hear, and they'll have microphone booths so they can talk. So they're wearing their comm cap inside their spacesuit. All right, so you learned a little bit about the space suit side of things. Now we'll talk a little bit more about the tools. So here on the upper left, you've got the PGT, or the pistol grip tool. So that's a picture of the real tool. The real one costs about $1.5 million. So when I asked NASA, hey, can I bring some tools to the Intrepid Museum? Can I have a PGT? And they said, we'll give you a plastic one. They wouldn't let me travel with the $1.5 million drill. But this is pretty cool. So it's a battery-powered drill that the astronauts use. We keep 3 of these up on the space station. And so the reason this one is actually made out of plastic is it's one of our training units. So you saw we do all of our training in the Nuclear Buoyancy Lab, which is a big pool. So we use water to help simulate microgravity. So it feels like you're floating in space. However, since we're here on Earth, you still have gravity. So if we were to have a really heavy metal drill in the pool, and you let go of it, it would still sink to the bottom. So we make a lot of our training tools. It's the correct size of the real drill, but it's made of plastic so it floats. So this is one of the drills that the astronauts use to train. What would happen if I'm out doing my spacewalk and I let go of this drill? It's going to float away, and they're probably going to deduct it out of my paycheck, and I don't make enough to pay for $1.5 million drill. So enter the retractable equipment tether. So this is a 6-foot long cable. You'd have one end connected up to your pistol grip tool, the other end connected up to the tool belt that you wear on the front of your spacesuit called a mini workstation. And now, if I let go of my drill, it's only going to go 6 feet away before it comes back, so I won't lose my tool. So you can actually see one of the drills right here, and you can see that retractable equipment tether holding the drill in place. So even more important than not losing hardware is not losing astronauts. So enter the safety tether. So the safety tether is probably the most important tool that we use while we're out spacewalking. One end hooks up to your spacesuit. The other end hooks up to one of these handrails you'll find on the outside of the space station. So the outside of the space station is covered in these gold handrails. And so even though we call it spacewalking, you're not really using your boots. You're actually using your hands to move hand over hand on these handrails outside the space station. So first thing an astronaut does when he or she starts a spacewalk is connect the other end of their safety tether up to one of these handrails right outside the airlock, which is where we start our spacewalks. And now I have 55 feet of table, so I can move all around the space station, do whatever I need to do, and if I let go by mistake, I'm only going to float a terrifying 55 feet away before this will retract me back in. So the astronauts are always wearing these safety tethers to help keep them safe. Another neat tool is the body restraint tether. So imagine I'm using, now I'm going to untether this, which is something you train astronauts to never do. Imagine I'm using my drill, and I'm floating in space, and I'm not holding on to anything. Once I start drilling, what's going to happen to me? I'm going to start spinning. So I need something to hold me in place, so that's when we use the body restraint tether. So this guy, right here, I think you can see pictures of the end of it here. So this body restraint tether, you can see right now how it's flexible. So one end plugs into the spacesuit, and once I get to an area where I need to use my drill, I'll find a nearby handrail. I will open these jaws, clamp this down, and now once I'm happy with the position I'm in, I'll rotate this collar, and what this collar does is it's actually tensioning a cable that runs through here, and now you can see it's rigid. So that then holds me in place so I can use both hands to use my pistol grip tool so that I won't spin around as I try to use my drill. So that is the body restraint tether. Alright, so let's look at some more pictures of spacewalks in action. So here you can see the body restraint tether. We're actually using it to carry our tool bag out to a work site. And I mentioned we don't use the boots for much. There's only one real purpose of the boots that we use, and that's to get into a foot restraint. And you'll see a video of an astronaut doing that later. So this is how we can hold ourselves in position on the space station, or if we needed to ride the robotic arm across the space station, if we're going long distances or if we're carrying a big box. These boots slide in here, and that helps hold the astronaut secure. So that's why the boots are shaped this way. Alright, so now we have a couple videos that we can look at. So this is from an EVA a couple of years ago. You can see the body restraint tether is clamped on a handrail to hold him in place. You can see the outside of the space station is covered in all these are electrical and data lines, and that's because we're constantly changing the outside of the space station. So I mentioned this spacewalk is getting ready to install one of those new docking ports for the commercial crew program. So they're out there doing spacewalks. You can see how everything's floating around. They've got their gold visor down. He gets to use the real $1 million drill. So anyway, that's a neat video from outside of the space station. Here's another video. Oops. Got it? Alright, here's another video of a spacewalk. So some of the recent EVAs that we've done just last month and later in the end of 2019 was to change out the big batteries that we have on the space station. So you'll see a picture of the battery later on, but the batteries are about this big. So we have 8 solar arrays, and each solar array has anywhere between 3 to 6 of these batteries. So these batteries are absorbing the energy from the sun and then storing it, so when the sun's not shining on the solar arrays, we can still power our space station. So some of these batteries are 15 years old and they're starting to lose their ability to charge, just like things happen with your cell phone battery here on Earth. And a lot of those batteries, the batteries are older nickel hydrogen technology, so we're now upgrading with lithium-ion batteries. So we've done a series of spacewalks to change out those old batteries for new batteries so that we can keep our space station going on. So you can see the foot restraint right there, and then you've got an astronaut getting ready to get in that foot restraint. I think those maybe you already saw when I was talking through it. Anyway, so there's some videos from spacewalks. So now let's talk a little bit about how we train astronauts to get ready to go into space. Because as you can imagine, space is a very unique environment. And we have nothing here on Earth that can simulate all of it in one place. So we need to use a lot of different facilities. So I mentioned a majority of things happen in the pool, but we also do things with virtual reality and other training facilities that you'll see pictures of. So here's more on the neutral buoyancy lab. The spacesuits that the astronauts use inside the pool are pretty much identical to the ones that they use in space, with the exception of the backpack. So I mentioned the backpack, or the PLIS, is what contains the oxygen and all the components that the astronauts need to keep the spacesuit working. Here in the pool, we use these long hoses, or umbilicals. You can see the green and yellow one. And so these are attached to the astronaut's suit, and then they run back to the edge of the pool, and that's providing the air for the astronauts to breathe. Their communication, their power, and all those services are provided through these umbilicals. So each astronaut will do at least 18 training runs before he or she flies into space. So the previous slide mentioned it takes 22 months to get an astronaut ready to go to the space station. So a new astronaut will come in. We actually have applications out there now. If anyone wants to apply to be an astronaut, you can come work with me at NASA. So it takes 2 years once they become an astronaut to be fully certified, to graduate. The recent astronauts who just graduated, and then you're assigned to a space station increment. It'll take another 2 years to get trained for that. So they'll do at least 18 training runs here in the pool. They also have the opportunity to scuba dive. If they want to just check out different parts of the space station, they can hop in the water and do a scuba dive to see that. So we're training the astronauts to get ready for anything that could happen during their 6-month stay. So we never know which piece is going to break next. So we have to make sure that they kind of understand the big picture, how everything on the space station works. So here's a video of an astronaut doing some stuff, doing some activities in the water. You can see we've got a lot of things, because we want to make them neutrally buoyant. We use a lot of blue foam that helps things float. So a lot of the tools will have foam attached to it, and you can see tools that are made out of plastic so that it feels more realistic. And each astronaut will have 4 scuba divers helping them out while they're in the water doing their work. So I mentioned VR. We use virtual reality a lot to train the astronauts. So even though the neutral buoyancy lab is large, it's huge, the space station is even huger. You can't fit the whole space station inside the pool, so we have to break the different components apart. So virtual reality really helps the astronauts be able to see end to end what the space station looks like. So we can train on the ground. They can also wear virtual reality headsets in space. And here's a video of what the virtual reality program looks like that the astronauts are using. So I mentioned you're up there for 6 months, you never know what's going to break. So this is a great tool for us on the ground. We can make a video to show the astronaut, this is what your spacewalk's going to look like. So we can highlight the path of those yellow handrails that take out there and show them the best way to get out to their work site depending on what they're doing. So we use VR a lot. We also use the astronauts to go into a vacuum chamber. So this is their one chance to try on a real spacesuit that's the closest to the one in space that they'll ever see. So we put them inside their spacesuit, we shut this big door, and then we pump all of the air outside of this vacuum chamber. And this allows the astronauts to learn what the real spacesuit sounds like, what it smells like. And this is truly keeping them alive, because since we pump all of the air out, if they were to try to take their helmet off, they would die. So this is a very good training opportunity for the astronauts to experience in their spacesuit. So while the Neutral Buoyancy Lab does all the training on the outside of the space station, this building, the Space Vehicle Mock-Up Facility, or SVMF, is where we do all the inside training. So you can see all the pressurized modules where the astronauts live and work. This is the European laboratory, the Japanese laboratory, the US laboratory, and what we care about right here is the airlock, which is where the astronauts begin and end all of their spacewalks. So here's some training on the ground. We have quite the international crew right here. We've got a Canadian astronaut, British astronaut, and an American. And they're getting ready, putting their spacesuits on, doing training on the ground. And you can see what it looks like in space. They look very similar. The only difference is Tim's floating in this image, so you know that it's in space. So the astronauts do a lot of their training there as well. We also have a gravity offload system that we can use to allow the astronauts to kind of feel like they're floating with a hang gliding harness. And remember the lesson we talked about, so here's a British astronaut, Tim Peake again. Remember the lesson we talked about, that if you're not hanging on to anything with the drill, once you start drilling, it's going to spin you around. And you'll notice Tim's not holding on to anything. He's holding the drill. So he's about 30 seconds away from learning a very important lesson, because the next thing that happened once he hit that trigger on the drill is he started spinning around. So he learned the importance of good body restraint and using this tether if you need to. All right, so that pretty much wraps up everything I have to tell you guys about today. So you learned a little bit about me, what it's like to train astronauts to do spacewalks, a little bit about what it's like to be a flight director, and just point out in this picture, these are one of the batteries that we talked about. So you can see the astronauts in their spacesuits with these big batteries. So okay, I hope you guys had a good time. We've got time for a few questions if you have any. Okay?
2 questions.
All right, 2 questions. Anybody have a question? Do you have a question up here?
How do you even train?
What was the question?
How does Eva train? How do you even train?
Oh, well, you saw how we train astronauts. How do I train? How was I trained? I can answer that question. So when I was selected as a flight director, I took a lot of the classes that the astronauts take to learn, even though I knew a lot about the outside of the space station based on my EVA experience, I didn't know as much about the inside of the space station and all the different subsystems that help keep it running. So I took a lot of the classes the astronauts take to learn all about that, and then we run through a handful of simulations where we're working in mission control on a simulated space station, and they're constantly breaking things to see how the team responds. So we spend about a year doing that before you're certified as a flight director. And if you guys want to see any of this hardware up close, I'll have a table set up over there right after this, so you guys can follow me over there and you can get your hands on some of this stuff. And I also have a workshop later in the day if you want to build your own space station. That's at 1:30. So all right, thanks guys so much.